After 4 rounds of the Shamkir 2018 tournament, there has been only one decisive game, and that's what you're going to see now. This Shamkir tournament is very strange. It's incredibly strong. There's Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, is playing. Mamedyarov, Ding Liren, Karyakin, Giri, and so on. But so far, with excellent preparation and sound defensive technique, the players seem to be cancelling each other out. Nevertheless, let's take a look at this decisive game. Played in round 4 between Veselin Topalov with the white pieces against Shamkir Mamedyarov. Two really uncompromising players. And Topalov opened with e4, and Mamedyarov likes to play the Spanish. He plays several different variations of the Spanish. But today he went for the so-called open variation, where instead of playing bishop e7 here, you take on e4, great favourite of Viktor Korchnoi. He was perhaps the greatest exponent of this variation. And it does lead to very unbalanced positions. All these moves absolutely mainline, so you can see the d pawn is attacked, that gets defended by the bishop. And black has this wonderful knight on e4. The only problem is if that's driven away and this knight manages to move, then white has a very attractive 4 against 3 pawn majority on the king side, which can roll forward, as we'll see. But it's a very double-edged position. Bishop e3 played by Topalov. Many moves in that position. Knight d2, queen e2. Bishop e3, about, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, was reckoned to be the strongest move, or at least a lot of attention was paid to this move. The idea is that the bishop controls these very important squares, and only then do you start to develop your queen side with knight d2. Of course, black has a pawn majority on the queen side, and that can also be dangerous if that rolls forward. Mamedyarov has had this position before. He's previously played queen d7. Here he snapped off the knight on d2 very quickly. Clearly he was still in his preparation. Wouldn't surprise me if he'd actually prepared this for the candidates tournament. Knight comes to a5 to attack the bishop. Well, the bishop wants to drop back to this diagonal, but black needs to do this in order to get his queenside pawns rolling. He desperately needs some counterplay in this position. And the knight comes into c4. Attacking the queen, attacking the pawn on b2. Queen d3, threatening the big one on h7, so g6. Now white could, of course, defend that pawn, but then will come bishop f5, and these bishops are traded, and that can be taken too, and, well, it's more than fine for black. So bishop h6, white simply gives up this b pawn and wants to get on with the attack. Typical Topalov, he is at his most comfortable when he is playing directly for the enemy king, and he's quite prepared to give up materials to do that. This is not a new position. I can see from my database that many strong players have played this with white. Kasparov actually had this in a simultaneous, where his opponent played rook e8. Let's just have a very quick look at this. And Kasparov sent his queen over to the king side. And, well, his opponent didn't even take this pawn. And Kasparov, with such active pieces, managed to win pretty easily. But the critical move here has to be knight takes pawn. Attacking the queen comes back to e2. So the rook is attacked, moves to the side, only one square. Now knight d4. This is the big idea, that while black has been snaffling the pawn on the queen side, then white has had time to remove this knight and advance the f pawn. this position has been reached in a few games. Frederick Yates, the great English player from the early part of the 20th century, had this position with white and crushed Gunsberg in 25 moves. Gunsberg played the knight back to c4, but here Mamedyarov played bishop d7, and this is the first new move of the game. And if you input this position into a computer, then it will spew out bishop d7 as the best move. So I have absolutely no doubt that Mamedyarov had seen this position before. Topalov, after almost 10 minutes thought, advanced the f-pawn. I think this is classic strategy in this kind of open Spanish position. This is exactly what white wants. And white's pieces are set up absolutely beautifully for this attack. The only thing is that black is a pawn up and can get his queenside majority rolling. So this is actually a very important moment. In playing c5, Mamedyarov would have had to calculate this variation with e6. This is obviously an absolutely critical move, which seeks just to blow up black's position straight away. In fact, black can get away with taking this. Now, if pawn takes pawn, then king takes, black is absolutely fine. f5 is critical, with the idea of taking and then taking on g6, and the king is in terrible danger here. But actually there is a saving move, and that is d3, which knocks out this bishop. And we can go a little bit further on. It's an interesting variation. White can expose the king, but basically he runs out of pieces in this position. White can get through to the king, but here black is 2 pieces up, and white simply doesn't have time to get a rook into the attack to checkmate the king, and black is winning this position. But it's close, and in a game you have to calculate that very, very carefully, or indeed perhaps before the game, more likely. So Topalov retreated with knight f3, queen b6. So we have a really unbalanced position with queenside majority against the kingside majority. Toppy builds up very nicely here, very calmly. He plays queen f2. So one point of this is to pin along here, which slows black down with his queenside pawn advance. But also he's looking to play the queen over to the king side. d4. Very important moment in the game again. It seems very tempting to take this pawn. There's a threat of advancing here, so bishop e4, attacking the rook. But here black can simply give up the rook in the corner, so giving up in exchange. But the initiative swings over to black in this position. That knight on e3 is of course a really powerful piece. That's not Toppy's way at all. He likes to keep the initiative, and I think he played absolutely correctly here by playing bishop to g5. So he's continuing on with his plan of bringing the queen towards the king side, playing for the attack. But in playing like this, he gives up another pawn. So what's the count now? Black is 2 pawns up, and the queen swings over. First a check here. King goes in the corner, and black already has to be extremely careful. If the bishops are exchanged on g5, that obviously threatens queen h7 mate. Pawn advances, and now the knight cuts back, threatening a nice check on f6, possibly also f5, and that is too much for the king. So instead of that, Mamedyarov just nudged back the bishop. And white carries on, f5. So the game is really reaching its climax. The attack is reaching its climax. Anyway, knight d3, blocking out the bishop. Very important move. And here, well, of course, we would like to play f6 and trade off these bishops, but actually it's just way too slow. White cannot get the queen into g7, because after this we play bishop c5, and well, white's attack is going nowhere here. So after knight d3, e6 was played. So this is absolute crisis point for black. If he takes with the pawn on e6, then pawn takes g6, and white is crashing through there. You can see black's queen is way across the other side of the board, and that spells trouble. Therefore, Mamedyarov gave up a piece on e6. He did that very quickly. Obviously, he'd planned this well in advance. So in this position, black has 4 pawns for a piece. But white's pieces are still really active. I mean, normally 4 pawns will be more than enough for a piece. On basic material count, black should be better. But because white's pieces are so active, it's a different story. This is still very double-edged. And here, it's actually very difficult to hold that knight. If the knight retreats, retreating the knight just doesn't look right when opening up the bishop, opening up the d file for the rook as well. Not good at all. So Mamedyarov simply brings the rook in the corner into play, gives up one of his pawns, but in so doing he actually gains time and has managed to coordinate his pieces. So now it's only 3 pawns for the piece, but black has good coordination, attacking the queen. Now this looks like a very strange move, bishop f4, obviously blocking but self-pinning. However, it allows the knight to come into g5, so actually white doesn't lose too much time here because he has a threat. Bishop e7 defends against that, and the queen comes back to g3. So white is well coordinated. I mean, both sides pretty well coordinated actually, and black now has this protected passed pawn on c3. Now it's Top's time to try and regain the initiative. Knight g5, hitting the rook, also looking at f7. So really this knight has to be traded off. So now in some ways the position is much clearer. It's a bishop for 3 pawns, and that bishop can run in and out of these dark squares. So black's king is still in some danger, not immediate danger, but black always has to be very, very careful about potential mates on g7 or on the back rank as well. So it's certainly not easy to get these pawns on the queen side rolling. And black is in something of a dilemma here. He doesn't know whether to trade pieces, because obviously his king is potentially under threat, or whether to hold pieces on the board. If he trades pieces, he could find himself in a losing endgame. It's very difficult. So I think objectively should be about level. But in practical terms, I think much more difficult for black to play than white. I mean, white's task is pretty easy here. You know, you want to try and attack, and if your opponent trades pieces, fine, you want to try and win the endgame. Mamedyarov played queen e6. Of course, to add to the fun, both players were running short of time, and certainly not easy, not an easy position. h3, very important move to give the king an escape square on h2. Now here's a typical dilemma. Does black trade some major pieces off the board? Well, Mamedyarov decided to trade the queens, and the king came up to h2. Queens exchanged on g3. Problem with this exchange is that black's king is still in some danger because of these weakened dark squares, and you know it's a difficult one. If black continues with, let's say, a5, I mean, it looks very attractive to establish this pawn chain, then white attacks on the 7th rank, hitting here. If that pawn advances, then the king just looks in a terrible situation, cut off on the 7th. We just need to get rook number 2 in and things are pretty bad. So, white could start with, say, rook a7, come behind this pawn. Problem with this c pawn is that the bishop always covers the queening square. So, and the rook can also go behind. So it's not easy to get this going. So Mamedyarov decided in time pressure to play h6, giving up one of these 3 pawns. But this was a bit desperate. After bishop takes, well, he desperately wanted to trade pieces. But, well, in fact, Topalov seems to want to keep the tension. And here, probably the simplest for Topalov is just to trade rooks and bring the bishop back. And this is excellent for white. Instead, again, time pressure plays a big role in this game. Both players seem to somehow hesitate. They weren't quite clear what strategy they wanted to follow here. So Mamedyarov is chasing this rook. Rook d5. Now that's a nice move from Topalov because it prevents a5, but also the rook can potentially just put itself behind the c pawn just to avoid any trouble. Rooks exchanged, finally. f6. Now they've reached the time control, and after bishop e3, actually Mamedyarov resigned. I mean, slightly premature, I would say. White should be winning this position, but it does take some care. Let's just have a little look at potentially a way to go. So, well, black can't do much here. But let's have a look. King f7. First of all, white should bring the king over to d3. So that means, obviously, this pawn is taken care of. Now white starts to attack these pawns. I think it's quite important that these pawns are nice and safe. Black can't go on a counter-attack. And let's say rook e6, then bishop c5, and this one is going to fall. Of course, it's still not that clear. So, for example, after c2, black can give this one up and counter-attack on the king side and take these pawns. But I'll just go a little bit further. I think I've already proved to you that black could probably play this position on with a clear conscience. It's still tricky. But here, with this bishop controlling these squares, then this will be winning. And this is a nice move. Bishop d4, controlling the a1 square. And this must be winning for white. The a pawn is going to go through, basically. And yeah, G pawn is going to be too slow. Tricky. Still very tricky at the end there. But, well, I'm very glad that we do have a decisive game with Shamkir. I mean, it's very interesting to see the difference between the Shamkir tournament and the US Championship, for example, which I will be returning to soon. In the US Championship, there's quite a variation in the strength of the players. And that means the strong players have to really hit out, and they're taking risks. So, we can see that Caruana took a risk in the previous round and actually lost the game because he just pushed it too far. So this variation in strength, I think, creates a more interesting tournament. That's my impression. Anyway, if you enjoyed that game by Vasily Topalov, then please do check out his playlist. There are lots of other videos you can see in the info tab up there. And there's also a playlist with Mamedyarov's games too. They're two very entertaining players, so do check those out. And if you're new to the channel, then don't forget you can subscribe, and it's free to subscribe, of course, and don't forget to like and comment and share. Thanks for watching.